Well, let me ask you a question to start you thinking a little bit this morning. What are some rules, maybe some laws, maybe some recommendations, some guidelines, those things that kind of fall into the I'm supposed to do this category that you just kind of don't do? You know, those things that, if you were to do these things, maybe you'd be a little healthier, a little bit more awake, a little bit more financially stable, but you just don't. Maybe it's like the speed limit. Like everyone knows you're supposed to max out at the speed limit, but yet it really doesn't stop you from driving 85 miles an hour on M6. So it's more of a speed suggestion than anything else. I mean, we got places to be. Maybe it's diets. Maybe you've met with a doctor and they've told you, if you were to do this diet, your cholesterol would come down, your blood pressure would be where it needs to be. Maybe it's diets because, you're like me and you need to lose a good 60 pounds, but then you're sitting there and the notion of the 10 p.m. taco run just kind of pops into your mind and it all kind of goes out the window. Because tacos are good at any time, but there's something about that 10 p.m. taco that just really hits the spot. Maybe it's something like, you're supposed to get 8 hours of sleep every night. Everyone knows that you're supposed to get 8 hours. Who gets 8 hours of sleep every night? Nobody. Because of 10 p.m. tacos. 10 p.m. tacos are the reason not to get 8 hours of sleep, because if you order it at 10, it'll be there 10:45, and then, you got to wake up at 6. So where's the time to sleep there? Maybe it's screen time related things. Everyone knows you're not supposed to be on your phone or your tablet or watch TV right before bed. And all the sleep experts have agreed to this. The light emitting from your phone, your tablet, any screen, it awakens your brain and it makes it so that you have a hard time sleeping. But yet, most of us, I would imagine, are on our phones right up until the moment we shut off the light, because you have to order those 10 p.m. tacos. And you got to make sure you get those things. There are all kinds of things like that. We know we're supposed to do this, but yet, does anybody really do this? If you end up behind somebody on the freeway who's going the speed limit, you might be like me and you just get a little annoyed at them. Don't you know you can go faster? I know what the sign says, but don't you know you can go faster? And there are some taco places that are closed at 10 p.m. What on earth are they thinking? That's the prime time for tacos. This morning we're going to be wrapping up our series that we've been in really since the beginning of June. This 8-week series, our summer series called Summer on the Mount. And what we've been looking at all summer long is Jesus' iconic Sermon on the Mount. Something that is probably read more than anything else in our New Testament. It's quoted, it's memorized, it's dwelt upon, whether you're a believer or not. There's been an infatuation with what we find here in Matthew 5 through 7. So we've been looking at that throughout the entire summertime, looking at what it really means to be citizens of the kingdom. And I have to be honest, right before we started this series, I had some doubts about whether or not this was even worth doing as a sermon series. I almost changed it 3 days before that first Sunday. Because here's the truth when it comes to things like the Sermon on the Mount. If you've been going to church, you've probably heard sermons about the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard Sunday school lessons about it, you've read it before, you've maybe memorized different passages from it. We all know the Sermon on the Mount, and that's always kind of the tension I feel when we ever study these really popular passages in the Bible. But one of the things I've noticed as we've gone through this series is just how important the words of Jesus are here for us today, maybe now more than ever before. Because what we found as we've studied this series is the importance that Jesus places on people. From the very beginning, he starts with the Beatitudes, and he's delivering this message of hope, of resilience, of encouragement to kind of the rejects of Jesus' day, the mourning, the grief-ridden people, the regular, everyday, down and out, regular people, not the religious leaders. He's talking to just normal human beings. And he's encouraging them, and he's communicating their worth, that they are citizens of the kingdom. They are who this kingdom will be built around. And we see this over and over and over again, all the way up until last week, where we talked about the importance and the danger of condemnation. And how Jesus has strong words towards us as we view other people from different walks of life, how we are not here to stand as the judge. Instead, we are here to be loving, to treat others the way we want to be treated. We find through each and every passage throughout this Sermon on the Mount the care that Jesus has for other people. And we, as members of this kingdom, are challenged to follow our King, to follow after Jesus. This morning, we're going to wrap up this series. So if you have a Bible, you can open that up to Matthew chapter 7. Jesus does something here that any Bible guru, any sermon guru, anyone who is a professor of teaching people to preach, or any author who writes on the topic of preaching would immediately frown upon. One of the biggest go-to pieces of advice that you get when you talk about conclusions, when you write messages, is to have only one. Have one conclusion and stick the landing. Jesus here would fail that class, because he here gives us 3 different conclusions to this entire message. But what I find is, and what we're going to see this morning, is that all 3 conclusions that Jesus gives us here, 3 stories, 3 illustrations, 3 examples, all convey a very similar theme. And that theme is, if you're to be a part of the kingdom, you're to follow the King. You are to follow Jesus. So let's go ahead and look at this first one here in Matthew 7, verse 13 and 14. You can enter God's kingdom only through the narrow gate. The highway to hell is broad, and its gate is wide for the many who choose that way. But the gateway to life is very narrow, and the road is difficult, and only a few ever find it. So here Jesus starts off his conclusions, and he gives us an example of 2 different gates, 2 different pathways, 2 different avenues to move forward. The first gate is this broad gate, this wide open thing that's easy to find. Our passage here in the NLT says it's the gateway or the highway to hell, and I know a lot of you are probably thinking AC/DC right now. You have it even run in through your mind. That's not really what Jesus is talking about here necessarily. A better way to translate this would be the pathway to destruction, the road to destruction. That's what Jesus is talking about here, and that pathway to destruction is broad, it's easy to find, and it's heavily trafficked. Now, to contrast that, he gives us another way, what he calls the narrow gate, this hard-to-find pathway that leads to life. This is what it means to be a citizen of the kingdom, to find that narrow gate, to be on that narrow pathway. And if you're like me, you instantly have questions run through your mind, like, why is it so narrow? If Jesus cares about people the way we've outlined throughout this entire series, why isn't it flipped? Why isn't the pathway that leads to life the broad one? Why isn't that the more easy to find pathway? I think one of the things that's important for us to note as we talk through these 2 different gates is really these are 2 different gates that talk about 2 different kingships. The broad gate is the pathway where we can be king of our own lives. This is the pathway that lets us decide how we handle our own affairs, how we treat other people. We become the gatekeeper for how that happens. So if there's somebody in our life that brings us joy, we can keep them around. But if there's somebody in our life who just kind of annoys us, who kind of irks us, who maybe hurts our self-image a little bit, it's really easy for us to just completely discard them because we are the king of our own life. This broad gate is the gateway that follows the popular trends, that says whatever is popular is therefore right because I'm the king and I have decided to be so. It's the easy way. Because if we can be king of our lives, no one can tell us we're wrong. So it goes through the process of just following the things that are easy, things that are convenient, whatever popular groupthink or fad or philosophy is out there. We can just follow those things without any kind of guilty conscience because we are the king of our own lives. Now, this narrow gate that Jesus uses to contrast that is a different kind of kingship because it says we are not the king, but instead, Jesus is king. And it's through the lens of Jesus that we have to filter all of the other things that we've talked about. We have to filter our actions through the lens of the king. We have to filter how we treat other people through the lens of the king. We filter any of the popular fads or groupthink things, or philosophies. All of these things get filtered through the king. What we find here is the first of three conclusions where Jesus is reiterating this main central truth. If you want to be part of the kingdom, you follow me. You follow Jesus. And I think that immediately becomes a harder thing for us to do than we want to admit. Because to make Jesus king is incredibly difficult. Just like those rules that we know we should follow, like the speed limit and going to bed on time and not being on our phone and eating right, just like those things, I feel like oftentimes the things that we've studied this sermon series over the last 2 months can easily fall into that same category of suggestions. Like I know I shouldn't be angry at other people. I know I should treat other people with respect and dignity. I know I shouldn't, lust after people, and instead I should value them. I know I should be forgiving. I know I shouldn't judge. I know I should be all of these things. I get it. I understand it. I know it. But then the situations come up. And it's way easier for us to be angry, to lust. It's way easier for us to hold grudges and not to treat people with dignity and respect when, according to our perspective, when we are king of our lives, they are not really worthy of it. So we read these things. We study it. We have conversations at lunch. We go and do these types of studies in our small group times, and we know what it says. But to choose the narrow gate, to choose the pathway where Jesus is the king, it's hard. And you might be sitting here this morning thinking, well, I'm at church. So obviously I've chosen the narrow gate. I'm here. I'm here more often than not, as long as there's not something else more appealing or more fun coming up, like I am here. And even when something more appealing comes up and it takes me away from here to meet in person, I have like a stream happening right now where there are people watching me from wherever it is that they are. I'm clearly on the narrow path. Jesus, I think, as he gets to this second conclusion, I think if we're honest with ourselves, I think he challenges us. Let's go ahead and look at the second conclusion, picking it up in verse 15. Verse 15. Beware of the false prophets who come disguised as harmless sheep, but are really vicious wolves. You can identify them by their fruit. That is, by the way they act. Can you pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? A good tree produces good fruit, and a bad tree produces bad fruit. A good tree can't produce bad fruit, and a bad tree can't produce good fruit. So every tree that does not produce good fruit is chopped down and thrown into the fire. Yes, just as you can identify a tree by its fruit, so you can identify people by their actions. Not everyone who calls out to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Only those who actually do the will of my Father in heaven will enter. On judgment day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, we prophesied in your name and cast out demons in your name and performed many miracles in your name. But I will reply, I never knew you. Get away from me, you who break God's laws. I think that this is one of those passages that we don't really enjoy. That we read it because it's in there, but if we're really truthful with ourselves, we try and skip over it as much as we possibly can, because it challenges a lot of the preconceived notions of what we have when it concerns Christianity as a whole. One of the oldest debates that has happened within the church for the last, really since Jesus spoke these words until today, has been the relationship between faith and works. You've got Paul as a good example of this. Paul, like in the book of Galatians, a book that we've studied earlier this year, you have this essential idea in the book of Galatians where Paul is repeatedly conveying this idea that we are saved by grace alone. You are justified by grace alone. It's all about grace. And yet, if you flip over a couple pages, you find the book of James, which really seems to convey a very different idea. For James, works is foundational for what it means to follow after Jesus. Works are important. And this is an argument that we continue to have today, maybe in a different way. We are saved by grace alone. And oftentimes what we do when we say that phrase is any type of works talk eventually ends up to this idea of legalism. That if you're going to talk about works, you're becoming legalistic, and I don't want to hear that because it's all about the grace. The problem with that is when you focus solely on grace at the detriment of works, you find yourself with a faith with no life. It is a faith that says I can say yes to Jesus, I can accept his grace, and then I can be the king of my life until I die, and then that grace I received way back then matters, and I can finally have something else. I think what we find here when we look at what Jesus says is challenging, because what it says is, yes, you are saved by grace. 100%. I'm never going to argue against that. You are definitely saved by grace. But what Jesus seems to say here is you are judged by your works. It's not either or, it's a both and situation. Yes, you are saved by grace, but the things you do on this earth matter greatly. To help us understand that, he gives us two different examples. Two different groups of people. The first group of people, those are what you might consider false teachers, those who come in sheep's clothing but are really ravenous wolves. They are out there with the intent of deceiving people. And what Jesus does is he tells us to look at their fruit. Because the false teachers, those who come in wolves' clothing but are really ravenous wolves, they cannot produce good fruit. Their fruit will always lead to chaos, destruction. It will always lead to a division. It will always lead to feuding. It will always lead to negative consequences. Don't be that. Don't be the type that deceives people. Focus on the fruit. And then on the flip side, he has the other side of the coin. Those who maybe, in a sense, maybe the deceived in this situation. They go out and they do the right things. But yet, there's no relationship. They come to church every Sunday. They do all of the right things, but there's no relationship to ground them in that. In a sense, it kind of reminds me of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13 when he's talking about love. That you can do all the talking you want, but without love, you're just a loud gong. You're just making noise. Those who try to do this without this relationship with Jesus, they're just being loud. Jesus here is again inviting these people who are listening, these people that were listening to him on the mount, and those here today who are opening up his word and continuing to study this passage, to focus on how you apply these things. He's inviting us to follow him, to bear good fruit, and to have this deep personal relationship with the Father, with King Jesus. Because what he's really after here is this idea that when we bear good fruit, it happens through this relationship. When we have this deep life-giving relationship, it transforms us to such a way where our fruit is good. It doesn't matter the past. It is transformative. This relationship with the King changes who we are from the inside out. But you have to put in the work. Let's look up the last little bit of it. Let's close out the Sermon on the Mount and pick it up in verse 24. Anyone who listens to my teachings and follows it is wise. Like a person who builds a home on solid rock, though the rain comes in torrents and the floodwaters rise and the winds beat against the house, it won't collapse because it is built on bedrock. But anyone who hears my teaching and doesn't obey, it is foolish. Like a person who builds a house on sand. When the rains and floods come and the winds beat against the house, it will collapse with a mighty crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he had taught with real authority, quite unlike the teachers of religious law. Jesus wraps all this up with his final conclusion. And this is probably a story you know extremely well, because Jesus, one of the things he does throughout his ministry is he teaches in parables, these stories that convey an important kingdom truth. And he does this because stories are the things that we often remember. I mean, it's probably easier for us to remember this story than some of the more do this, don't do this type of stuff that we found earlier, because we are driven and attracted to stories. So here, Jesus communicates the same idea. Follow me with a story. And it's a story of contrast. You've got a good builder and you've got a foolish builder. You've got a house that's built on bedrock and one that is built on sand. You've got a house that when the storms come is able to withstand the storms because of its foundation. And then to contrast that, you've got the other that was built on sand that as soon as those storms hit, the house comes tumbling down. You have a picture of somebody who follows Jesus and one who merely hears these words and then moves on as if it doesn't matter. And the thing I think is really interesting about this is we hear this parable, and every single one of us is instantly like, well, of course I want to be the wise builder. Of course I want the house that I built to be on the good foundation. Of course I want it to be able to withstand the storms of life. Of course that is what I want. Because the truth of it is none of us seek to be foolish. None of us seek destruction. None of us seek the sandy foundation. But if you think about it, oftentimes the actions of our lives betray us. Yeah, I'm going to read the Bible. Yeah, I'm going to go to church. And yeah, I'm going to even join a small group. But it's just kind of hard to fully trust the King when instead of trusting the King, I can kind of put this little thing away and I can kind of focus more on controlling these different aspects of my life. Like, I trust the King with my life, but I don't really trust the King with my kids' life. So I'm going to really be kind of heavy-handed in this area. And, my marriage, that's kind of off to the side in its own little thing. And the way I handle work, that's, okay, yeah, there's the church me and then there's kind of the work me. And we kind of do this thing where we thinking we're building our life on the foundation, we're kind of building our house spread over all of it, and it just kind of ends up looking a mess. So as we finally wrap this series up, I think we are finally challenged with this big question. Are we really focused on building our foundations on the words of Jesus? Or are we treating these words of Jesus as kind of like an idealistic, of course Jesus would say that type of thing? Like, yeah, of course Jesus would tell us to do these things. He's Jesus. I'm clearly not Jesus. So, it's good to consider, but when push comes to shove, I'm going to kind of just do whatever I want. Where are we building our foundations? Are we building our foundation on what it really means to be part of the kingdom? These things that we've been studying for the last 8 weeks, are we building our kingdom? Are we building on this foundation of the kingdom that views others as valuable? Are we building this foundation on this foundation that says things like lust and anger actually are important and worth devoting some of our attention towards? Are we building a foundation that values forgiveness, that values turning the other cheek, that values things like not condemning other people and instead leading them to the truth through our love? Are we really building our foundation on that foundation? Or is this just a bunch of words? Let's pray. Lord, we thank you. We thank you for your word. We thank you for this Sermon on the Mount that has breathed life into so many people for centuries. We thank you for the example that we have in your Son, our King, who leads us into this kingdom where we can partner with you to make a difference in people's lives because people's lives matter to you. Lord, we pray that as we close off this series, that the journey itself doesn't end, that we continue to pursue you, to pursue the words that we found here in the Sermon on the Mount as we become doers of your word and not merely studiers. Lord, be with us as we develop a heart of compassion, a heart of service, and a heart of love for others. Lord, in your name we pray. Amen.